Hi, my name is Tony Lyle, an application engineer with Prolim, and today we're going to talk about the override position command inside NX and how to use that with multiple CAM files using the same fixture assembly. So let's take a look. I'm going to start by creating a new file. So I'm going to show 3 ways to create or start a manufacturing setup similar to my last webinar that you can reference on our Prolim YouTube page. So for this one, I'm going to reference an existing part, and I'm going to browse for, these are the 3 parts we're going to deal with today. I'm going to start with the 4-inch wide cavity. So I'm using the master model, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a component. I'm going to add a Vise assembly to this. We'll use our Vise assembly here, and I'm not going to create any blanks. Again, you can refer back to my previous webinar on how to create manufacturing setups for more detail on this, but I'm just going to basically constrain everything right to what would be the workpiece. So let's go ahead and use some assembly constraints. I always like to start with a fixed constraint, and I fix my vise. And then I can use some simple touches to touch the sides, the back to the back jaw, bottom of the part to the bottom of the vise. We'll apply those. But once I try to constrain this vise jaw to this part surface, I get an overconstraint because this is not able to override the position of the vise assembly itself. So let's take a look at the vise assembly. What would you generally do? One thing you could do is to just move this in the vise assembly itself. So if we look at the assembly vise here, I have a degree of freedom in this floating jaw. So I could give it an assembly constraint of a 4-inch distance. Now that'll make this part look great, but what happens if I do a part of a different size? So let's take a look at that as well. Let's take a look at this insert, which this part is only 1 inch wide. So again, I'm gonna create a new file from this insert. And this one, since I have this active, again, refer to my last webinar, but it's already set to the part to reference. Here's our part. I'm going to add my vise once again. And we'll go ahead and constrain these as well. My fixed constraint. And we'll touch these surfaces together, these together. We'll use a distance constraint for here. And we'll put a distance of 1.5 inches. Once more, if I try to do a touch a line, I get it over constrained. So what I could do is I can go back to my assembly vise, and I could change my distance constraint from 4-inch to 1 inch, which looks great on this file. However, that's going to disrupt this file because it's set to 1 inch. So I'm using this same assembly vise.prt file for both manufacturing setups. So it's not able to adapt to both of those. So using override position is how we can get away from that. So I need to go back to the assembly vise, and in this distance constraint, we're going to change this from distance to distance limits. We can put an upper limit and a lower limit. Now the lower limit Since this vise can collapse all the way to 0, we'll make that as a 0. What can we make as the upper distance? I can set my upper limit to around 8 inches or so. I can use this as a reference to see how that would look. Looks like that might be a little far, maybe just 7.5 inches or so. I'm going to change that to 6. We'll make the upper limit 7.5 inches. As of right now, this is just 6 inches based on this distance. And this is just going to be the reference, the default starting point of this assembly when I use it in the future. I'm going to uncheck the distance here now. So all I'm using now at this point is the distance limits. The upper and the lower limits is all I'll be using moving forward. So now as I go back to the setup one here, we can see it's moved back to the 6 inches. And I can hover over the floating objects and override the position. So I can override the assembly component position. So we'll simply click that and use the assembly constraints once again as a touch. We can touch from here to the side of the part, and now we're closing up on that part and clamping up on it. And as we look back to the 4-inch part, we can see that's not affected now. And in fact, it's still at the 6-inch spacing. So we can override the position on one of these parts as well. Either one of these two components, you can use the override position. And we can touch this surface to this surface once again. And neither of these are affected by the other now. And the assembly vise is still set to 6 inches wide. So let's do one more part. We're going to create a new file. This is our third method of creating a manufacturing setup. I'm just going to do a modeling application this time. And we'll name this the 7-inch boss file. And on this one, we're going to add all of the components, including adding the master model to this one. So we'll add the vise first. We'll create the fixed constraint, yes. And let's add the master model, the 7-inch part. All right, so I'm going to start with my override position. I know I'm going to need that, so I'll start with that. And now I'll just set my assembly constraints using our touch align. I'll start with centering the part from here, center it to here. And now I'll use the touch align. So we can see once again, we are set to 7 inches here, while the other ones are still set to 1 inch and 4 inch. We can remove all these displayed constraints in the graphic window here as well. I'd like to get rid of those. So that's the override position functionality. Let's take this one more step further and let's create a whole new vise. I'm going to build a brand new one using a couple of components that I've already got set up here. We'll call this one an assembly of a centering vise. It's self-centering. I'm going to go ahead and add my components in. And we'll add the centering vise base. We'll apply that fixed constraint in there. And I'm going to go ahead and add the jaws into this as well. So I've got a jaw here that I'll add in. I'm going to move this one around a little bit though. Rotate it 180. I'm going to move it back a little ways. And I'm going to add that jaw in a second time. We'll just move it out this way. So we do still need to do our assembly constraints to this. So I've got my fixed constraint already. Now I'll use some center constraints. So I'm going to center the vise jaw to the vise base. as well as this jaw to the base. And I'm going to center the outside of the vise jaws to the vise base as well. And that'll center this up. That'll keep this centered up. I just need a couple of touches. Touch the bottom of the vise jaw to that surface, and this vise jaw to this surface as well. Our last constraint is going to be our distance constraint in between the two vise jaws. And we can start with maybe a 5-inch. But again, we're going to set distance limits to this. So our upper limit may be 6-inch, where our lower limit may be 0. And again, I can use this as a visual just to see if 6-inch will work. It looks like that probably will go out to 6 inches, but I want it to default to maybe 5-inch. If you'd like to do that, you can. So I'm going to uncheck distance. So there's my vise setup. And now I'm going to use my insert, my 1-inch wide insert, to start another file. This one's going to be a manufacturing file with setup 2. And we'll use this vise assembly on this one. So we'll add the centering vise assembly. And I'll need to move my component up so I can see it. There we go. All right, so right away, the first thing I want to do is just override the position in this. So on my assembly constraints now, I'll fix the base, and I'll just use touch aligns from here on out. I'll touch bottom of the part to this surface. We'll touch the side to here. And we'll use the back side of the part to touch to the gripping point of the jaw, and as well with this one. And then once I select that jaw, they'll both collapse and keep it centered within the vise base. So if we start another file, once again, if I use the cavity 4 part, we'll use the 4-inch wide part to create a new file, and we'll use that vise assembly on this one as well. So we'll add the centering vise assembly, change our override position, and constrain the part. I will touch, I'll start with my fix. And I'm going to touch the side of the part here, and the side of the part to here. Again, we can see both of those jaws are moving. And then we can just center it onto the vise. So once more, if we look at the 1-inch insert setup 2, we can see that those jaws are not being affected by one another, and they're moving independently per manufacturing setup file. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, and please let us know if you have any questions or comments. And please visit our Prolim YouTube channel for more content. Thank you.